The first group of data types we'll cover are string or text data types. We've already seen varchar. We're now going to look at CHAR or CHAR. Let's do CHAR and varchar, okay? Here we go. Let's talk about CHAR. What is it and how is it different from varchar? Both of them allow us to store text. And if you ever have questions, I highly recommend you go to the docs. They have a great page just explaining CHAR and varchar because they are very similar. That's actually the first line of the documentation here. They are similar, but they differ in the way they are stored and retrieved. They differ in their maximum length, and they differ in when you might want to use one versus the other, even though they both store text. So we know that varchar allows us to specify a maximum length. I can do, create table, how about just friends? And then I can have each person have a friend that is a varchar. And then I could say their maximum length, let's just keep it short, just so that we can see what happens when I exceed it, will be 10 characters, which I know a lot of people have names longer than 10 characters. That's okay. So when I create that table, if I do an insert into friends, whatever size name, assuming it's less than 10 characters, that I insert will be stored as is. So insert into friends name. If I do a couple of examples here, like Tom, how about a longer name like Juan Pablo? How many characters is that? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, right up against the limit. And then let's do one more. That was a typo. Let's try that again. Okay. Our last one here will just be, I don't know, how about James? Okay, so now we have 3 rows. If I do select star from, what I call it, friends, we see our different names, unchanged, of course. They're all under 10 characters, or in this case, exactly 10 characters. We include the space. It doesn't matter if it's a letter of the alphabet, the English alphabet, or a space, or a dollar sign. Whatever character counts as a character. Anyway, my first point I want to make is that these vary in length. Names generally vary in length. Some people have really small names. Some people have longer names. Text in general in the real world varies in length for a lot of different entities, a lot of the different types of text or strings that we store. And that's what's nice about varchar. It's optimized to be able to store text of different sizes in the best possible way. But if we know that we're going to be storing text that is the same size or almost the same size, for example, if I'm storing state abbreviations for the US, Colorado, California, Alaska, that sort of thing, Alabama, those are all 2-letter abbreviations. And they always are 2 letters. They are fixed in size. And that is where the CHAR or CHAR data type can come in handy. CHARs have a fixed length. When I create a column with the CHAR type, I specify the size of that column, and every single string that I insert will be stored as that size. In other words, if I did create table states, and I'll just keep it simple, like we'll call this I'll just call it, ABBR is going to be a char of 2 characters, and exactly 2 characters. And I insert into states, abbreviation, values, and then we'll have CA, and one more here. How about, what's another? New York. Okay. When I select those back, we're not going to see anything different. Select star from states. We have our 2 states stored, CA and NY. But what is different is how much storage this takes up behind the scenes. This is optimized to store 2 characters and take up the least amount of memory possible to always store 2 characters. Because I said it's fixed in length, it's always 2 characters. That doesn't mean, though, that I can't store something smaller. It just means that, let's say I wanted to store a 1-letter abbreviation for some reason, like X. What MySQL will actually do is add white space to make it fit 2 characters. It will pad it. And then when I retrieve it back from the database, it will remove that padding and it will look like nothing has changed. But behind the scenes, it's actually expanding any of my strings to fit that fixed size. So that's a significant difference. If I do something like char 3, we're essentially saying this column should always be 3 characters long, But if it's smaller than 3 characters, MySQL will expand it, will balloon it using whitespace characters to fit 3 characters. And here's an excerpt from the docs explaining just that. The length of a char column is fixed to the length that you declare when you create the table. That length can go anywhere from 0 to 255, but it's always fixed. And then when you store values in a char column, they are right padded with spaces to fit that specified length. And then when they're retrieved, those spaces are removed, unless we'll worry about this SQL mode thing. I'm actually going to cover that in the next section, but there's a setting you can change that will alter that behavior. So the big downside of using a fixed length is, let's say that I want to allow up to 10 characters for somebody's name, but if somebody's name is Tom, then MySQL is going to store that in a fixed column with a bunch of spaces to fit 10 characters. Whereas with VARCHAR, it doesn't care about that size. It doesn't care if it's 3 or 5 or 10 characters. I mean, it cares about the maximum size, but it doesn't care about any variability, hence the VARCHAR. It's totally fine if it varies. And it's optimized to store stuff that varies in length. Whereas CHAR of 10 is only really optimized to store things that are 10 characters long. It can store things that are smaller, but it is wasteful if you really dive down into how much storage it uses up. And here's a table. This is mostly taken from the docs with some changes that shows what I'm talking about. So if we have char of 4, meaning a fixed size of 4 characters, and we try and store an empty string in there, it's going to add 4 spaces, and that will take up 4 bytes. If I try and store a 2-character string AB, it's going to pad on 2 spaces to make it take up 4 bytes. If I have 4 characters, ABCD, well, it keeps it as ABCD. It takes up 4 bytes. It's fixed in size. It's going to take up the same amount of memory. And then we have the equivalent using VARCHAR, where we have a max size of 4. If you try and insert an empty string, or this actually might have a space in it. I think it does have a space. So it's a single space. It's going to leave it as is. It doesn't care, and it will store it taking 1 byte. If we have 2 characters that we try and insert AB into a VARCHAR column, it keeps it the same. It takes up 3 bytes. And if we have 4 characters that we try and insert, we'd see that it's completely unchanged. It's just 4 characters, but it takes up 5 bytes. Now, the actual byte sizes don't matter, and that can really vary depending on the types of characters you're actually storing. Some characters take up more memory, some really complicated characters, multi-byte characters. But we're not worrying about that. If we do an apples-to-apples comparison, we see that if we use VARCHAR to store something 4 characters long, it might take up 5 bytes. With a CHAR, it might take up 4 bytes. So that shows us that it is more efficient in terms of storage or space to use CHAR when your data is similar in size. Because if we were always storing 4-character strings, well, it might take 4 bytes if we use CHAR. But if we tried to only store 4-character strings with VARCHAR, it takes up 5 bytes. So we have way more flexibility here. If our data varies, it might not take up as much space. But if our data is really always the same size, or plus or minus maybe 1 character, if it's always 10 characters or 9 characters, then CHAR might be a better choice. So here's some examples of where we might want to use CHAR. Things like state abbreviations, yes or no flags, YN, zip codes, where it's always going to be 5 digits, at least in the US. Postcodes in the UK, they have letters, I believe, but I think they're always the same size. So something like that, where there is a fixed size for the piece of text you're working with, then it's better to use CHAR. If not, I stick with VARCHAR. You can worry about memory, you can worry about storage and bytes and all of that. When you get to the point where it really matters, you'll know it really matters if your queries start getting really slow, if you have a boss or people complaining to you about your schema and the data types need to be reconsidered. That could happen. But if you're learning MySQL right now, that's possibly a long ways away. So I would boil it down to this. Use CHAR for fixed length things if you know they're always going to be the same size. Otherwise, stick with VARCHAR. One last thing that I'll show is what happens with either data type when we exceed that limit. So if we describe states, we have char of 2, right? It's a fixed string of 2 characters. So what happens if I do this? Insert into states, and then we have abbreviation, I think is what we called it, ABBR, values, and I do something, let's do a short one first, just the letter X. That's fine. Remember, it's going to pad it with a space in memory, but when I select it back out, select star from states, we can't tell that there's any extra space. I guess how would you tell anyway? But if I did something like this, we could do this, right? Select char length of abbreviation. Remember this string function. We see that it does in fact call it, or it views it as 1 character long, but in memory it stores it as 2 characters. It adds spaces. Okay, but back to what happens if we insert something that is too long, like I try and put Ohio in here. I get a straight up error. It says data too long for that column. You can't do that. And when I try and select from states, Ohio didn't make it in there. It wasn't truncated. It didn't store like OH. It stored nothing. Now, when we talk about SQL modes, the sort of settings that we can change to alter the behavior of certain things, we'll see that maybe that's not always the case. But the standard SQL solution to this problem is to throw an error and not insert your data. The other option, of course, would be to truncate the data and actually just store the first 2 characters, but that is not what happens with the current mode we have set up, the default strict mode. And the same goes for VARCHAR. So what was our table we made at the beginning? I've already forgotten of this video. Friends. Right, so if I try and insert into friends, we had a name, and then somebody who has a really long name, like this, same thing. Data too long for that column name. It's more than 10 characters, which I believe is the limit that we set up. Yes, 10 characters. Okay, this has been a long video. I hope you're still here, and if not, I hope you got what you needed and you understand the difference between CHAR and VARCHAR. All right, I know it's kind of dull.